And the legislation to ban pay equity in this country, well, they say it's banning, they're simply redefining it so it costs less. It's passed through all of its various committee stages and readings and is now the law. It's a really interesting issue, pay equity, and I'm aware that Sean would have had Catherine Rich on this morning, who I think is from, now who's she work for? She goes and works for Business New Zealand. She's a chief executive, former National MP, former Dunedin resident, I think. Obviously living in Wellington now, or woman. Mind you, there's not an awful lot of difference, really, between Dunedin and Wellington. They're very, very similar in terms of topography, and I would even argue in terms of demographic and political makeup. The differences between Dunedin and Wellington would not be, they would be the two most similar cities in New Zealand, I would think. They look the same, they're built on hills, they're windy, it's crap weather, the worst weather in New Zealand descends upon both Dunedin and Wellington. Neither of them get a summer. No. And they've got the same sort of people there, university educated, very left, heading, into green Marxist territory, really, and extremely well paid. Well, that's where it all breaks apart, doesn't it? They are in Wellington, they're not in Dunedin. But there you go. All right. Anyhow, point is, she was in Dunedin. I think she was National Party list MP. And then she was always talked about, actually, Catherine Rich, along with a couple of others, as being prime ministerial material. She was going to be the first elected national prime minister. No, I said elected national prime minister. Jenny Shipley could never have got elected. God, don't the National Party... No, well, she didn't. But anyhow, cut a long story short, she was on with Sean this morning. And she was on with Sean this morning in part because of pay equity. But the real problem is that private sector wages now have really dropped behind the public sector in this country, which is screwy, really, when you think that it's the private sector that drives everything in this country. I mean, the reason we have an economy is nothing to do with the public sector. It's everything to do with the private sector. And it's the private sector who are the risk takers, the entrepreneurs, the exporters, the importers, the retailers, the developers, the R&D experts, the innovators, if you like. They are the people who make and have always made New Zealand great. It's the private sector. Now, the public sector, there's two ways of looking at it. You could say, well, they're a burden. They're sort of the monkey on the back that you can't get rid of, and by God, it's now grown to sort of first orangutan and now gorilla proportions. It's that sort of monkey. Although it's an ape, isn't it? It's evolved. As it's been sitting on your back, it's evolved from being a monkey into an ape, and it's 5 times the size and it's 10 times heavier. There's that particular viewpoint. Or you go, the public sector is the necessary grease, the oil that makes the machine work. Well, I'd have to say I'm heading to the hairier option just quietly at the moment in terms of the public sector. As we know, it grew exponentially under the last government. 18,000 new full-time jobs increased. And of course, the extraordinary thing for those of you who are listening in either the public or the private sector at the moment is that for all of those 18,000 jobs, public service in New Zealand actually declined. There is not one graph, one set of tables, one set of statistical data that you can look at over the last 5 or 6 years when it comes to the public sector and saying it's going in the right direction. And this is despite 18,000 new jobs being created. Yes, well, now, if that's not bad enough, the latest statistics from Stats New Zealand show that the average ordinary time hourly earnings in the private sector were $40.39 an hour. So that's not bad, actually. I would have thought $40 an hour. $40 an hour. So that's the average wage or salary earnings in the private sector for a full-time employee. Guess what it is in the public sector, Josh? I suppose you've listened to Sean this morning. You'd know the answer to that question, would you?
No, I actually missed it because I was out doing something.
There you go. You see, that's what happens when you go to the toilet.
50,
no.
60,
Well, the answer to that is it's $10 more, Josh. So the average hourly earnings in the public sector are $50 an hour, and the average hourly earnings in the private sector are $40 an hour. Now, you just think about that for a moment. A, how the hell did that happen? And B, you've got paid 20% more, is it 25% more? So it's 25% more, isn't it? To work in the public sector than you are in the private sector. Now, given that the public sector doesn't create anything, it doesn't make this economy work, it doesn't create wealth, then why would you be paying them 25% more? And then what sort of message are you sending, well, let's just say to my children, for example, at university? They think relatively bright, particularly the two girls, the boys, the jury's out on Theo just quietly. But, two girls, relatively bright, they'll presumably graduate. And when they go and get a job, if they're going to stay in New Zealand, I've definitely said, do not do your postgraduate stuff in New Zealand. I think I've got that through. Pretty sure I have. Anyhow, they're going to go, Dad, I can earn 25% more in the public sector I can for just simply sitting on my bottom, pushing a few buttons, writing a few reports in the public sector than I can in the private sector, where I could actually be creating wealth, jobs, export revenue, and ironically, creating the taxes so that we can employ those bums sitting in the public sector. It's an appalling mismatch, and it might explain why New Zealand, in actual fact, over the last decade, can't blame it all on the last government, I have to say, the last Labour government, has had declining rates of productivity, declining rates of educational achievement, declining health standards. Our maternity standards are third world now, I would argue, and essentially declining economy in comparison with the rest of the Western world and other OECD countries who we used to compare ourselves against, but we don't like to do that now because it's too bloody embarrassing. So I'm just saying to you this morning, this country has got it out of whack. You might argue that, and here's the other thing. So yesterday the pay equity legislation goes all through it. Well, it's going to cost billions to do it. You know who is going to advantage most? The people that the so-called, the pay equity legislation that Labour made, almost just you have to be a woman, you'll get paid more because you're a woman. I mean, it was almost that stupid, the legislation that was annulled yesterday in its entirety, and thank God for that. But the people who were most going to be advantaged by that, you got it, employees in the public sector, who are already paid an average of $10 an hour more than those in the private sector, and who create no wealth at all in this country. And if you look at teaching standards, for example, or you look at our hospitals and medical services in this country, if you look at the police, if you look at almost any aspect of public sector in this country, you can't honestly say that they have improved and we are on an upward trajectory as a consequence of the public service being paid 25% more than everybody else. It's an absurdity. I raised this issue this morning, and it's not relatively complex, it's pretty simple in actual fact, to say that if you want to know why New Zealand's declining, if you want to know why we've lost first world status, if you want to know why all our best and brightest are heading off to Australia, the UK, the United States, Saudi Arabia, Oman, God, anywhere else but New Zealand, the simple answer is there is no future for them here if this is the construct that you are creating. If I'm going to be rewarded more for innovation, for enterprise, for commercial acumen, just for sheer smarts and intelligence overseas, why wouldn't I go? And why would I stay here, where a burdensome public sector is literally the gorilla on the back of us all? And don't forget how much you're paying in tax and GST as a consequence of having such a huge public sector in this country, delivering bugger all. Now, and just let's go to the next issue on pay equity. Who is number one up on the cab rank for pay equity, eh? Who is going to get the most upset? Apart from, the opposition parties, but listen, that's their job to get upset. That's what you do in opposition, get upset. government have done this, It's sort of like a Pavlovian response of being in opposition. Doesn't matter what the government does, you're always going to get upset. So let's just put them to one side for a moment and go to the interest groups that most moaned yesterday, screamed when this pay equity. They were teachers. Oh, listen, I'll come to that in a second. Social workers, nurses and healthcare workers. Now, the fascinating thing is, when it comes to nurses, for example, they are paid significantly more in the public sector than they are in the private sector. And why do you think that is? Because nurses get the most extraordinarily generous allowances, shift allowances in particular, working at weekends. If you want to know why hospitals are crap in this country on Saturday and Sunday, I'll rephrase that, even crappier than normal, then the answer is because of the extraordinary penal rates that are paid in the public health system of this country as a result of authoritarian standover merchant tactics from nurses' unions and a variety of other health groups in the particular health sector. Instead of looking at, as we all do now, the week being the week, and there's Monday to Sunday, and we treat Sunday the same way, and we treat, we in actual fact, in the public health sector, 8 to 5. It's a bit like the police, actually. They're a bit like this too. Monday, 8 to 5. Oh, can't possibly have your weekends. If anything happens, don't call the police, because they can't possibly be there. They're literally not. But apart from ED departments that work over the weekend, and they have to, everything else seems to go into decline. But we're going to pay them more money, apparently, than the monies that they're getting at the moment, which are already more than the private sector, under pay equity. But teachers is classic. We talk about institutional sexism and racism in this country. Well, no, we don't, do we? We only talk about institutional discrimination in this country if it fits the liberal left, pseudo-Marxist, green, whatever, wokey stuff. If it fits that construct. We can't possibly talk about institutional sexism, for example, and discrimination when it comes to teaching, because the people that are discriminated against are men, boys, male. You know those filthy things with a penis? Yeah, those ones. Those grubby ingrates, those ones, who've been running the show. They were the real origins of the settler economy and all the bad things like capitalism and putting men on the moon and curing cancer. Yeah, anyhow, it doesn't matter, that sort of stuff. Them. Women have hounded, and liberal men out of the teaching profession over decades. I'll give you an example to show where it started, although I suspect it started even before then. In the late 1970s, early 1980s, teachers' colleges routinely stopped young boys, or if you like, seventh formers, from applying to teachers' colleges because, guess why? They came from single-sex boys' schools. And so in the days in which teachers' colleges, you went through it was easy enough to get the marks. I mean, you didn't have to be all that bright to be a teacher even then, but a lot less now. But there would be an interview process. And routinely, boys from single-sex schools were denied the opportunity to go to teachers' college because, well, frankly, you're the wrong type of person. And if you're a white boy from a middle-class community or family and from a single-sex school, you were routinely discriminated against. All right. And it's got worse ever since then. Now the vast majority of teachers are women. Never used to be that way. It was roughly 50-50 in primary in the 1960s and 70s, and there was a vast majority of males who taught in the secondary schools in the 1970s. But as a consequence, deliberate consequence of teachers' colleges and of the feminization of both the curriculum and of the teaching profession, we now find that most teachers, as we know, are women. Okay, now here's the logic. Here's how it goes. So now in early childhood, only 3% of all teachers in early childhood are men. 3%. That's ludicrous. I remember, for example, when I became a single parent, and I looked at my stats and I went, God, I wonder how many, because I was interested. I wonder how many Michaels there are. I had 3 children to look after. What were they when I got them all? Full-time care, they must have been 8, 6, and 4. Or were they 7, 5, and 3? No, they were 8, 6, and 4. All right, and I can remember thinking to myself, I didn't obviously get the domestic purposes benefit, I worked, but I can remember thinking to myself, I wonder how many single parents are out there, because when I looked at single parent societies or things to support mechanisms, because I thought I do need some help, and I don't care how good you are. If you are a single parent, male or female, with 3 kids of that age, yeah, you need help. And I didn't have any immediate family assistance, so. And I was looking around at all the organisations. They're all female-dominated, all female-run. There was no way in the world that I can join any single-sex or single-parent group because, well, frankly, they were constructed for women. But I remember thinking, I wonder what the stats are of people like me, and it was 1 in 10, okay? So this is going back now 10-odd years, but it was 1 in 10 of single parents in this country were males, and the other 9 out of 10 were females. Well, how did that get to be like that anyhow? This concept even then that women were better parents is bollocks, I have to say. That's just not true. Gender doesn't determine whether you're a good parent. Being a good parent determines whether you're a good parent, irrespective of your gender. Anyhow, which is how I ended up with my children. Can I just also say that only 3% of early childhood, 10% of single parents. So you can already see that mismatch. I mean, it doesn't even reach the single parent rate in this country. For primary, it's 85%, although if you take the principals out, it's 90%. And for high schools, and this is where the big change has happened, particularly in the last 20 years, 2/3 of all teachers now are women, 2/3. Now, why is all this important? Because as a consequence of the last pay equity legislation, all of the teachers had been able to mount, irrespective if they're male or female, a pay equity claim on the basis that they are a female-dominated profession. Well, that's because you've hounded all the males out. I mean, if you want gender discrimination, and one of the reasons why our boys are failing, there's your answer, in one. And as a consequence of that, they were able to mount a pay equity claim to the government, and assumedly, I don't know what they would have ended up with, maybe an extra 15, 20% under the old legislation that was voted out. This is the nonsense that pay equity is, and this is why it shouldn't even exist. The market determines what people are paid and worth. It always has, it always will. There might have been past anomalies back in the 1950s and 60s, and I think up until the mid-1970s, when equal pay wasn't granted in this country for reasons that we discussed yesterday, but those days are long and truly over. And now we're still having to fight the shibboleths of the left, of the liberals, of the pseudo-Marxists who still argue that somehow institutional discrimination only happens to people that are the favoured, whether culture, ethnicity or gender, and that you should be rewarded for such even though you contribute nothing to the economy of the country. Pay equity is a shibboleth. It is an illusion. It is wrong. And thank God, not far enough in my view, but at least we had some recognition of that in the Parliament of yesterday. Those are my thoughts. What are yours?